We are in modern-day Rome, and we are down across the river near the Vatican. And if you go down to the Vatican today and you go into St. Peter's Basilica itself, and you follow the crowds off to the right, you will come to a window that looks onto one of the greatest sculptures ever sculpted during the Renaissance. And that sculpture is the Pietà by Michelangelo. And the Pietà has gone through a number of various stages of showing. It was at one point more accessible. You could walk up to it, though of course at some point someone attempted to mar it with a hammer. And so today we actually can only view the Pietà from afar through glass. And not a few people, particularly Protestants who go to see the Pietà, often marvel at the fact that the Pietà, though it depicts Mary holding Jesus after the crucifixion, after he has been brought down and he is lying there dead, they often notice that it appears as if we are only really to look upon Mary. In the modern way that Pietà is shown to us, when we look upon it, we really can't even see Christ. We can tell that there is a dead body laying across her lap. But at least first and foremost, it doesn't appear as if that is the focus of the sculpture. It would seem as if the sculpture is more about Mary and less about Christ. And over Catholic history, since it was sculpted and finished around the time of 1500, Catholics themselves have seen this sculpture, the Pietà, as predominantly about Mary. At one point, there was actually added to the scenery several cherubim, several angels, who were holding a crown symbolizing the coronation of Mary as something like Queen of Heaven, or at least as an intercessor on behalf of good Catholics. But the Pietà is one of the most important sculptures in the Renaissance. And if you go back in time to the Renaissance itself, when Michelangelo is sculpting the Pietà, one of the things that we can notice pretty quickly, and scholars have pointed this out again and again, is that the Pietà was not originally designed to be seen the way we are seeing it today. Michelangelo was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Renaissance sculptors and painters and artists. And when he was contracted to do the Pietà, he was already, before the age of 30, one of the most famous artists of his day, and soon to be one of the greatest artists of human history. And Michelangelo does a number of things with the Pietà that is very interesting from an art history standpoint. First and foremost, the piece of marble that the Pietà is carved out of is really spectacular. It's one of the most flawless pieces of marble that has ever been used to create art. And the shape of the entire sculpture itself uses some of the new techniques of the Renaissance that were designed to allow for a better perspective for those who are viewing it. Just look at Mary, for example. She has Jesus laying across her lap, and from the perspective of the sculpture, it doesn't seem as if anything really is amiss. But if you take Christ off Mary's lap and have her stand, you'll quickly realize the sort of gargantuan proportions of Mary that Michelangelo has sculpted. She would easily tower over Shaquille O'Neal. She would palm any basketball. Her proportions from the waist down are stork-like, almost impossibly long legs. And her shoulders and upper torso are just simply elongated. Now, this was part of the Renaissance revolution in art, the use of imprecise or improper proportions in a piece of art that were designed to allow people to see the portrait or the sculpture properly when viewed from afar. The other thing that historians have pointed out about the Pietà, however, is that the modern way that the Pietà is housed and shown is not how Michelangelo originally intended it to be. For example, Michelangelo never intended for the Pietà to be up on a pedestal. That was not the original design. The original design had the Pietà resting on the ground. The other thing we know is that the Pietà was originally housed in Old St. Peter's, not the current St. Peter's Basilica, but the old one. And it was housed up in a north sort of transept area off to the left in something like a rotunda area. And what we know of that rotunda from drawings and from descriptions of it is that it was lit from above, that there were windows out of the top, near the ceiling, near the domed portion, and that there were not any windows at, say, human level. And so historians have reconstructed it in part, and they've constructed how the Pietà should have been viewed versus how it is viewed now, up on a pedestal and with spotlights shining up into Mary's face. And historians have noted that Michelangelo's original intention was not to have Mary be the focus, but was rather to have Christ be the focus. You see, because in the original, it would have been on the ground, and it would have been lit from above, through natural light. And historians, somewhat reconstructing what this might have looked like, have come to the conclusion that it would have been quite different to have stood before the Pietà in the Renaissance itself. That Mary's face, if lit from above, given the fact that she is bowed, her head is bowed almost in prayer before her Lord, would have actually been shrouded in shadow. And, more importantly, that from the ground, off of the pedestal, and with the natural light shining down from above, we standing before it would have only been contemplating Christ. We would have seen Christ there laying on her lap much easier. In fact, it would have been the focus for us. And Mary's head shrouded in shadow would have been, in many ways, our own perspective, that here we lie between the cross and the resurrection during a time of intense trial and tribulation as the church seemed to sort of struggle with the perspective of what to do with the death of their Lord. And so Mary would have been more like us rather than Mary, Queen of Heaven. She would have been in prayer, shrouded in shadow, and only with Christ being lit and only Christ visible. And so the focus of the viewer of the original Pietà, as Michelangelo had intended it, would have focused on Christ. And in many ways, the difference between the Renaissance Pietà and the Pietà as it is shown to us today is analogous to the way humanism has changed in our perspective over the years. How in the original, humanism was actually quite a good thing, that it gave us, for example, biblical languages, a new appreciation for art, a new appreciation for languages and letters, and these kinds of things. But that over the years, over the centuries, humanism has been elevated up, and, as I like to say, the spotlight has been shown on the wrong things of humanism. That humanism has sort of become out of proportion to its original design. But that was not the intention of humanism. Humanism was not designed to be what many of us assume it is or was, which is a humanizing movement or a self-aggrandizing movement of the human over against the theological or the divine. And so our misunderstanding of humanism often leads to a misunderstanding of this period of time as a whole, as well as, more importantly, a misunderstanding of the Reformation and the fact that so many of the reformers were heavily influenced by humanism should give us some pause with the claim that humanism is somehow disingenuous or somehow self-glorifying or self-seeking, self-serving in the way that it approached the intellectual life or the Christian life. And so in this lecture and in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at humanism, and we're going to ask the question, what was humanism actually like in its original intention? Was it a philosophy? Was it an artistic movement? How does an artistic movement that raised the profile of people like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and all these other artists, how does that humanism compare and contrast and connect with the humanism that affected the Reformation and that shaped so many of the Protestants who came out of the Catholic Church, who reshaped and reformed the church on biblical grounds?
Put simply, humanism begins in Italy, but with some specificity we can say that it begins in and around the city of Florence. Now, there were other cities and other factors and other figures involved, but if you take Florence out of the equation, it is really hard to see how humanism gets going. But if you take some of the other cities and some of the other figures out, humanism might very well have continued on with perhaps a little less persuasion than it had before, but it would have continued. Florence, in and around the late 14th century, begins to develop a certain capacity and a certain desire for classical antiquity. And it's hard to see how all of this synced up. It does seem to come together almost at once. But it starts with a series of scholars and artists and writers who so far outstripe the Middle Ages that it does seem to be the birth of something new. And in fact, that is where we get the name, the Renaissance, as being the rebirth, as if there is a rebirth of some new glorious understanding and some new technical skills in art and in languages and in scholarship that had been lost for some period of time. And the reason for this seems to be, some scholars argue, the ongoing depression of the Black Death, that as the Black Death ravaged much of Europe, including Italy, that there seemed to arise this desire to get beyond the Black Death, at least from a psychological standpoint, by doing something glorious and with beauty and with excellence. If life is short, let's do it right, as some people might say. Let's not simply wait for death, but let's live to the glory of God while we still have years left. And there are two major figures at this period of time that could be cited. One is in the area of art, where you have Giotto, who in and around the area of Florence begins to develop a new understanding of realism through the process of foreshortening and shading in his art. And Giotto, of course, lives right around this time, right about the start of the Black Death itself. But his move was to understand art as a realism, to try to get as close to the realism of the subject as possible, while still being a piece of art and a work of art. And flowing from Giotto and many others, you see the emergence and the flowering of a period of art that is really unrivaled in the history of art in general. Very quickly on the scene, you have Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, and many other artists that come onto the scene and suddenly explode with this not only technical skill, but this desire to do art on grand scales for the glory of God and for the glory of their period of time. This sort of civic pride of do things for Florence, do things for Italy, do things to kind of combat this pall that has descended upon Europe that says that we are all simply ready to die because of the Black Death.
Now, we can say a few things about humanism at this point, both in terms of where it's coming from an artistic standpoint and from where it will eventually go with literacy. One of the things we have to understand about humanism is that it is not a philosophy. Humanism does not believe a certain ism. It does not come from a certain philosophical position that is comparable, say, to Aristotelianism or Platonism or Stoicism. In some ways, having something called humanism is itself one of the problems with how we interpret it in these days, looking back into the 14th through the 16th centuries. But humanism is not a philosophy. Rather, humanism is an approach to learning. It is an approach to the theology of the day and to all types of fields of study. Humanism, in other words, is really a perspective on what is the most important thing to study. And in that sense, humanism is eventually contrasted with scholasticism. And we'll talk more about the differences between humanism and scholasticism in our next lecture. But we need to say now, up front, that humanism is focused primarily on what we would, in a college curriculum, call the humanities. Subjects that are more of the area of persuasion or of general learning, history, ethics, languages, rhetoric. All of these subjects are part of what we would call the humanist curriculum. And that comes from the fact that humanists are not, again, seeking to have one philosophy that overarches all of it as a specific ism, but rather they have a particular approach to learning and to the good life and to a well-educated life that differs from that of scholasticism in the Middle Ages. Humanists believe that scholasticism was wrong not so much by its content, but by its lack of attention to things like ethics, to beauty, to art, to rhetoric. So you see, for example, humanists criticizing scholastics for being inelegant, for the way that their Latin is kind of hackneyed and put together poorly, that it doesn't have a sense of flow and beauty to it whenever they are writing. And you see in humanist art that there is a sense of revulsion, not arrogance per se, but a sense of inadequacy whenever they look at art from an earlier time period. That what humanists want, what they desire, is a philosophy in the general sense that approaches life and the study of learning itself. And it's for this reason, the fact that there is no single philosophy, no single ism, that humanism can take on all kinds of different shapes and sizes. You do occasionally find humanists in the Italian Renaissance who are more or less antagonistical to the church and to dogma. But those are few and far between. You also find artists who are not principally all that concerned with ethics or history or philosophy or dogma. but they're not opposed to these things. They are just simply artists. And you can also, in the North, as we'll see in a bit, find people who are humanists who only care about biblical texts, biblical studies, and languages. And so when we look at humanism in general, its initial impulses, even when we see that in Giotto, the initial impulse is to do things better, to do things more properly, to advance our skill and our learning and our studies so that we are better rounded people. And it's perhaps for this reason that all the way down until today, whenever we call someone a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman, what we mean by that is someone who has wide depth of knowledge in all kinds of fields, and that depth of knowledge has somehow increased the quality of their life.
Now, the last person to discuss about the rise of humanism is the figure of Petrarch. Petrarch is one of these figures who seems to, on his own power, by his own might, his own prowess, seems to spark a revolution in the subject of studies of the classic antiquity. Petrarch's writings and his philosophy and his understanding of various understandings of history and of ethics and of literature really sparks humanism itself, really by a model of what humanists could be. Again, humanism not being a philosophy in and of itself, didn't really have to look to the philosophy of Petrarch. There have never been, nor will there ever be, Petrarchists walking around believing that they somehow follow the philosophy of Petrarch himself. However, there have been lots of people who have looked at Petrarch as the supreme humanist or one of the principal humanists in the Western world. And Petrarch was one of the guys who did live through the Black Death. In fact, he was a survivor of it himself. And that reality, that near sort of brush with death, combined with his own capacity for intellectual study and rigor, pushed him to really challenge the idea that the Middle Ages was a model of time to be emulated, was a period of time to be emulated. And in fact, it was Petrarch who gave us the very classic three-part view of history that we all still repeat all the way down until today in our history lessons. Petrarch was the one who believed that we could divide human history up into three great periods of time: the classical golden age, the medieval age, literally the Middle Ages, the time between two great periods. And then, Petrarch said, the Renaissance, or the rebirth of his own day. It was also Petrarch who either said aloud or who at least alleged that the Middle Ages was the Dark Ages. And it's from Petrarch that you get this sort of snobbish look to the past, as if the Middle Ages were not good enough for him. But, again, coming from the Black Death and coming from the world as he knew it, the desire was to be better than that. The desire was to elevate one's understanding of both literacy and learning and the arts and these kinds of things. And, more importantly, it is Petrarch who gives the first shot across the bow at scholasticism. Petrarch writes a book called On His Own Ignorance and That of Many Others, a satirical book in which he looks at scholastics, and he argues that not only are they stupid, not only are they foolish, not only are they inelegant in their prose and in their ability to write, but they are impractical. And therefore, lacking practicality, Petrarch argues, there is simply no reason to abide by scholastic teaching. And so what you see in Petrarch is this two-pronged attack, in which on the one hand he alleges that there's something wrong with the very recent past, the Middle Ages, and there's something that needs to be discovered, therefore, in this new rebirth. And secondly, and this is a hallmark of much of humanism, at least in terms of the humanism of the scholarly world, what Petrarch does is he lays the blame at the feet of the theologians of the Middle Ages, the scholastic theologians. Not because he finds that their teachings are necessarily all that wrong. He doesn't think that religion or theology or philosophy is a bad thing. Rather, Petrarch's criticism is that the scholastic world has not done good theology. It's not that they're theologians in and of themselves that's the wrong thing. It's the kind of theology they're coming down with, a theology that is impractical, that is logic chopping, that is simply there for the academics and the scholastics and these kinds of things. And so what Petrarch holds out is a two-phase system in which he says, one, the very recent past is wrong, and it is these bozos here, these theologians, who have caused much of the problem, and therefore they should take the blame. And so from Petrarch on, you get this development of an idea that the problem is between humanists and scholasticism. And, more importantly, you start to see some shadings of a problem, that this is a problem between humanists and those who are running the church. And that understanding of humanism comes home to roost in the Reformation, when Luther and others, many of whom have some engagement, or in the case of, say, Calvin or Melanchthon or Butzer or Cranmer and others, some very extensive exposure to humanist letters and writings, you begin to see that when the humanists, like Petrarch, all the way back in the 14th century, begin to allege that it is the theologians of the church, the leadership of the church, that is causing much of the problem, you can see how this might begin to affect things, intellectually speaking, as we move forward. And so, historians actually began to differentiate between the humanisms of the latter Middle Ages. On the first hand, we talk about the Italian humanistic movement, or the Italian Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance, of course, is the period of time with Michelangelo and Da Vinci and the Sistine Chapel and the Pietà and the David and all of these wonderful works of art that are there in Florence and in Rome and all these places. Now, these periods were happening right alongside, just prior in some cases, to the Reformation. And so therefore, when we talk about the Italian Reformation, what we're talking about is predominantly a period of art and of the visual arts. However, recently historians have begun to talk about Northern humanism. And Northern humanism really is the heir to Petrarch. Petrarch being the man of letters, the man of writing, the man of languages, the man of classical antiquity. Well, as humanism and as the humanist spirit, we say, moves north of the Alps and moves into places like the Netherlands, into Germany, into France, and into England, what we begin to see is that the same humanist skill, the same humanist desire to reach into the antiquities of the past, not into the Middle Ages, but into the antiquities of the past, that as humanists of the North begin to do this, they predominantly focus on biblical education and the problem of the biblical understanding of theology itself. What are the foundations for doctrines like penance or purgatory? What are the rationales for understanding the Christian life the way the Catholic Church was conceptualizing it? Should we know Greek and Hebrew? These kinds of questions. And so historians differentiate between, again, the Italian humanist world and the Northern humanist world, not because they're radically different, but because they take on different emphases, different tones, different focal points. However, as we'll see, the northern part of the humanist world, of the humanism that is up in the north, that is in the areas that will be heavily hit by the Reformation, are heirs to the same humanist spirit as those of Michelangelo and Da Vinci and those down in the Italian peninsula. And it is that look at the northern humanist spirit and the biblical studies of the northern part of Europe that we'll look at in our next lecture.